afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is John Coombe. I'm with EA Engineering, Science, and Technology, Inc., and I serve as one of the co-chairs for the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. The Education, Communications, and Outreach Working Group, along with Jody Kauser. We're really glad you're able to join us today for this commission talk on recommendations for climate action.
Yes, welcome everyone. I'm Jody Kauser, Senior Vice President of Communications for the Chesapeake Conservancy and the co-chair of the Education, Communication, and Outreach Working Group. First, I'd like to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded. While we've disabled video function with the exception of our presenters, by remaining in the meeting, you are consenting to this recording.
We hope to have a few minutes at the end to take some questions, which you can send by email to the Communications Director for the Climate Change Program, Susan Casey, at susan.casey1maryland.gov. We likely won't have time to answer all of your questions during our time together today, but Susan will coordinate a response if your question isn't answered during our meeting. Her email address is will also be posted in the chat. It's my pleasure to introduce Secretary Grumbles now. Ben Grumbles has been leading the Maryland Department of the Environment since 2015, as well as the Commission on Climate Change. He recently attended the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, more commonly referred to as COP26, in Glasgow, Scotland. Secretary Grumbles.
Thank you, John. Hey, welcome, everyone, and thanks to all the commission members and the 100+ volunteers who participate in the working groups of the Maryland Climate Change Commission. By law, the Secretary of the Department of the Environment gets the honor of chairing this very important commission, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that and continue to see tremendous collaboration and important work of the commission itself to provide information and recommendations to the governor and to the General Assembly and to the public and all the stakeholders and citizens throughout the state of Maryland. And this commission has, particularly since 2015 and with the expanded legislation on the commission, it has become in many instances a national model for other states to have an independent commission that's robust and balanced. We have 27 members of the commission and over 100 volunteers who serve in the different working groups. So I'm very proud of the work, and I'm particularly proud and honored to be able to have MDE staff supporting the important work of the commission. And just a quick shout out to Mark Stewart. He's the manager of the climate change program for MDE, and Mark, with great support from his team, helped us all move forward with urgency and with collaboration. I also just want to say that MDE, as the Environment Department, has a responsibility to develop a detailed, comprehensive plan with actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. By law, we're required to adopt a plan that would reduce emissions 40% by 2030. Our plan, which was finally completed in February, gets us to, I say, at least 50% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. There are also some very important actions, this economy-wide strategy that's worth keeping in mind and using legislators and others as an important additional item as members and citizens and stakeholders continue to develop strategies to ensure Maryland is a leader on mitigating, adapting, and increasing resiliency on climate change. And I would just say that the department, Maryland Department of the Environment, is taking important actions that weren't necessarily required by law, but the actions like banning hydrofluorocarbons through regulation, and also working with Department of Transportation, General Services, Energy Administration, and others on in significant investments in electric vehicle charging infrastructure and moving more and more with clean cars legislation and incentives towards zero emissions. Our big goal is to get to net zero emissions by 2045 and also 100% clean electricity by 2040. This discussion, this seminar is about our recommendations that were recently completed, the annual recommendations of the Climate Change Commission to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. And our report, our 2021 report, includes 54 recommendations on mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. And we hope everyone, not just on the commission, but citizens, policymakers, students of all ages, get familiar with the work of the commission and the particularly the most recent recommendations. Now, it's my honor to introduce one of the many people who make the commission successful and collaborative, and that's Ann Linder. Ann Linder is the Vice President for Government and External Affairs at PEPCO, and she's a co-chair of the commission. Ann?
Thank you, Secretary Grumbles, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Ann Linder, and as Secretary Grumbles mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Government and External Affairs for PEPCO and Delmarva Power. While my day job is in the utility industry, I don't serve as a utility representative on the commission. Instead, I serve a broader role as a representative of the business community as a whole. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act recognized the impact that Maryland's climate change efforts will have on Maryland's businesses, and the commission is structured in a way to give a voice to that sector. In fact, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act includes several requirements that are directly tied to economic impact to the state. And those include a requirement that the GGRA plans produce net economic benefit to the state's economy and a net increase in jobs. But it's important to recognize that several of the strategies being evaluated by the commission are bold policy changes that will have an impact on businesses. And that could be from a cost perspective, or it could be from an implementation perspective. Say, for example, how do the builders adjust their business models to accommodate all electric, energy efficient buildings? Accordingly, it's critical that the commission hear from the business community and understand the impacts to Maryland businesses when the commission analyzes climate change strategies and mitigation. And with that, I will turn it over to one of my co-chairs, Kim Coble, who is the Executive Director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Kim?
Thank you. Thank you, Ann and Secretary Grumbles. It's a pleasure to be here. As Ann mentioned, I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Maryland LCV is a nonprofit that uses political action and education to fight for clean water, healthy air, resilient communities, and fight against climate change. Along with Ann, I am also the co-chair of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, and I am also co-chair of the mitigation work group along with Mike Powell, and we'll introduce Mike in a little bit. I'm the environmental representative on the commission as a co-chair, and it's been an honor to play that role. I want to acknowledge that there's other folks on the commission from the environmental community, and I want to acknowledge the work that they've done on behalf of the environmental community. Our voices are as equally as important as the business voices, and I would say that have been equally respected, which has been a nice aspect of this. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm proud of the work that the Commission has done over the past year to create the 2021 annual report and the list of 54 recommendations that are within it. I believe that if the recommendations in the Commission's annual report were fully implemented, Maryland would be leading the nation in reducing, mitigating, and preventing impacts from climate change, and it would be doing it with an eye towards the disproportionate amount of impact on many Black and Brown communities. I also want to express a great deal of confidence in the process that's used by the Commission and the mitigation work group. The process includes both the opportunity and the encouragement for public participation. There's lots of members of the Commission, but but the general public has been welcomed at all turns. We have interests are involved in shaping these recommendations in the environmental community, labor, the business community, agricultural community. We have both state and local government representatives and academics, and they're fully participatory, regardless of their official role in the Commission. The process is also transparent. All meetings are open to the public, and there's a very well-maintained website that the Commission and the work group uses to have meeting agendas, past and future, and notes available along with a lot of resources. I will say that the process also at all steps prioritizes ensuring that there's an equitable and just transition, especially for low-income households and communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And the last point I want to make about this process that I have a lot of respect for is the space for disagreement. Given the diversity of members in this on this commission, it's been really important that we leave room for disagreements. There has been time for discussion and debate, and if needed, we create subcommittees, and those dig deeper into the disagreements and the best recommendation moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of buildings. So it's been an honor to serve on this commission, and I am proud of our work. I would now like to introduce the co-chair, another co-chair, Charmaine Brown, who's Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Finance of America Companies and serves as a co-chair of the commission. Charmaine?
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. As Kim said, I am Charmaine Brown, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Finance of America Companies. Today, I am not representing the Finance of America Companies, but rather in my capacity as one of the co-chairs of the MCCC. I am responsible for the climate justice team, which is comprised of a liaison from the commission and a liaison from each of the commission's working group with the knowledge of diversity and equity. So similar to our nation, Maryland's minority population continues to grow, and our state is now minority majority since the 2010 census. The Hispanic population rose by 4%, followed by the Asian population, while the African American population remained stable. Given these demographic shifts alongside of the continuous impact of climate change, we have been focusing our efforts by giving special attention to the marginalized populations and communities that are under-resourced and less resourced. To be clear, this is not to place any more value on one population over another. It is simply to recognize the need to go deeper and to be more targeted in our response, to think about those who are furthest from our norm and our mainstream. And I'm sure if you've taken a look at our strategic plan, you recognize that special attention was given to low-income populations and the under-resourced populations throughout the entire plan. Whether you're talking transportation or power or in any of the categories, you will see that we gave special attention to those historically marginalized populations so that we do not leave anyone behind. So it is with that backdrop that I want to emphasize again our focus on BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the disproportionate impact that climate change has on those populations. One of the first things that we did as a group, which is very important, is to be clear about our mission. Why do we exist? When groups come together, oftentimes we assume that we all understand and are clear about our mission. We made no such assumption. We spent time agreeing on what our focus would be. And so the climate justice team supports, encourages, and ensures that the work of the MCCC facilitates equitable outcomes for all Marylanders, with a special eye towards those who are and have been historically marginalized. Another thing that we did was focused on competencies as it relates to culture. One of the challenges in doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a misperception of what this work is, and also assumptions that we all tend to come to the table with. As Maryland continues to grow even more diverse, we recognize, especially with the largest minority population being Hispanic, that we needed to understand the nuances of culture as we seek to do this work. And so we spent a half day immersing ourselves in what we called our climate, culture, and competency conversation, recognizing the 5 continuums of what it means to be culturally competent and how you adapt based on the situation. We also spent time identifying stakeholders and compiling a database of organizations, including faith-based organizations, who are important to the work that we do. One of the things that will go to the next point that I'm going to make in terms of another area of focus is on representation, making sure that those with a lived experience are part of the conversation, that their voices are heard, and when we had roles that we could fill, that we would seek to fill those roles with diverse individuals. So much so that we have onboarded a professor from Bowie State University and a leader from the Baltimore Office of Sustainability for our 2022 work. So again, paying attention to representation. I think it's also worth pointing out the passion and commitment that we bring to this work. As Ann said earlier, and I think Kim alluded to, we have day jobs. We come to this based on our commitment and our passion to see the impact of climate change minimized and mitigated so that all Marylanders can live out healthy lives and reach their potential. And so in collaborating, we spend a lot of time outside of our day jobs focused on doing this work. Now, in terms of this year, some of the things that we will be focused on, we're going to undergo an unconscious bias training. I don't think training can be overemphasized. Unconscious bias is a part of the human wiring. And again, as we do this work, we want to make sure that we are aware of our own biases and that we have the tools and we are equipped to disrupt those biases. We're looking at ways to incorporate and embed DEI concepts into things like the Climate Academy. Those decisions have not been made, but we will be exploring that this year. We're going to be looking at tree equity, looking at ways to leverage tools like the EJ screening tool so that we can be more targeted in our response. And then also looking at issues like the racialization of green space. And so there's no silver bullet, but I'm really honored to be able to do this work with some of the most incredible people I think that the state has in the Maryland Department of Environment. And I hope to hear from you if you have questions at the end of the presentation. With that, thank you. And I would like to now introduce Dr. Peter Goodwin, President of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science and Chair of the Commission's Scientific and Technical Working Group. Peter?
Well, thank you, Charmaine. And this has been a very busy year for the science community in Maryland and around the world. The Science and Technical Working Group represents Maryland's universities and covers a broad range of disciplines from atmospheric sciences to ecology to human health and economics. The STWG is supported by scientific liaisons from state agencies. In addition to their own expertise, STWG members help ensure the right experts are engaged from our universities and relevant research programs are known to the Commission. I would particularly like to recognize the role of our HBCUs, whose institutions are set in the communities most impacted by the effects of climate. And if we could bring up the few slides, please. Maryland has a long history of science-informed environmental policy, and the Climate Change Commission is no exception. The role of the STWG is hindsight, reviewing results of studies and reports such as the Salinity Intrusion Plan, providing insights to provide deeper perspective on issues of importance to the Commission, such as acidification of Chesapeake Bay or the role of livestock in the production of methane, and foresight, looking to the future for sea level rise projections for Chesapeake Bay or tracking emerging technologies. We can go to the next slide. Secretary Grumbles represented the state of Maryland at COP26, and there was a flurry of scientific reports released immediately prior to this global conference that emphasized the need for urgent action and helped inform the COP discussions. One example of these reports is that produced by the IPCC, the Physical Science Basis Report. In prior IPCC assessments, the conclusions were largely nuanced with probabilities for any assertions given. What was different in this report is just how definitive some of the conclusions were. And here I just give a couple of examples. It's now unequivocal that human influence is warming the planet. And secondly, this warming is leading to greater variability in the weather, more intense droughts, floods, tornadoes, wildfires. And you'll see this often referred to as climate attribution. The next slide, the climate scientists have estimated that if we can keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, it gives nature and society a chance to adapt. To do this, we need to reduce the heat-trapping gases that are released to the atmosphere. Currently, and again, this was produced by the WMO and the Carbon Disclosure Project. Currently, we are on track to pass this 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold in the 2030s. And there are severe consequences to Maryland. If we go to the next slide, we can expect to see increases in extreme precipitation, increased frequency of river and coastal flooding, intense rainfall that can damage agriculture, tornadoes, greater incidence of heat waves, and the loss of temperature cues for fish and other environmental resources, as well as the suppression of vectors that we are used to experiencing through cold winters. And since 1980, NOAA has been tracking the frequency of $1 billion weather and climate-related disasters in the United States. Applying that survey to Maryland, we can see that in the 1980s, Maryland was, on average, having about one of these $1 billion events every other year. And this frequency has been increasing alarmingly, so that over the last 4 years, we have been averaging 4 of these $1 billion events per year. If we can go to the next slide, for further details of some of these implications to Maryland, I encourage you to review the annual report or go to the Commission webpage. And I'm just going to focus on one example here, and that's related to sea level rise. Maryland is one of the most vulnerable states in the US to sea level rise. And UMCES is required to update these sea level rise projections for Maryland every 5 years. We do this in collaboration with experts from across the state and federal agencies, from the universities in Maryland and across the nation, as well as the NGO community. And from our 2018 report, we can expect to see by 2050 a little over 1 foot rise in sea level. And whatever we do with greenhouse gas emissions in that time, there isn't a lot of variability. Where the big impacts begin to occur is between 2050 and 2100. And this graph makes the predictions on 3 scenarios. One is if we globally follow the Paris Climate Accord. Another is stabilized emissions at 2018 levels. And the third is if we keep allowing emissions to grow at the same rate we've experienced over the last few years. And under those projections, we can expect up to 4 feet sea level rise by the end of the century. However, these projections do not account for what's happening in what's known as the cryosphere, or the poles and Greenland and the loss of ice cover. If we go to the next slide, what we're seeing and the scientific evidence, particularly in the last 24 months, has been a slew of findings showing the instability of many of these ice masses. And as the cryosphere becomes increasingly unstable, we could be experiencing between 4 and 8 feet sea level rise in Maryland by the end of the century. And in Maryland, we're already very familiar with some of these consequences. The next slide shows the documentary High Tide in Dorchester County. If you haven't seen this, I would encourage you to go either on the webpage shown on this graph or through many of the professional associations that have picked up this as an example of what sea level rise means to local communities. And if we go to the next slide, scientists have been spending a lot of time. This is just one example of predictions. A very interesting study was completed by Dr. Ming Lee and colleagues at UMSES and Salisbury University. And what they did was very clever. They simulated the 2003 Hurricane Isabel that created record flooding around Chesapeake Bay. And then using their models, they asked the question, what would happen if that same storm happened in 2050 or 2100 under the various sea level rise predictions of the 2018 report? And the consequences are dire. For the city of Baltimore, shown in this figure, in 2003, in today's dollars, about $25 million of damage occurred from that one event. By 2050, we can anticipate seeing about 4 times the damage experienced in 2003. And depending on the action we take today to control these heat-trapping gases, we could see up to $200 million in today's dollars by the turn of the century for the same storm. These predictions emphasize what we have been observing since 1980. Damages are increasing with time, and no action costs Marylanders. And there are many other examples where preventative action taken today through mitigation and adaptation will produce future benefits. And to expand on these benefits, I would now like to introduce Matt Fleming, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources, who is substituting for the chair of the Adaptation and Resiliency Work Group, Secretary Jeannie Hadaway-Riccio. Matt, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Goodwin, and thank you everyone for your attendance here today and your interest in the work of the Commission. As Dr. Goodwin said, unfortunately for all of us, I am not Secretary Riccio, but I'm standing in for her today as she is currently participating as a member of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Mark, you get the first slide. I'll do a quick introduction of myself. So my name is Matt Fleming. I've been with the Department of Natural Resources for about 23 years, largely working in coastal management as with the department. So I'm here to provide a quick overview and purpose of the Adaptation and Resiliency Working Group, or ARWG. It is chaired by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and supports the charge of the Commission by developing a comprehensive strategy for reducing the state's climate change vulnerability and providing state and local governments with tools to plan for and adapt to current and anticipated consequences of climate change. I'd like to note, while on this slide, you only see the appointed members of the ARWG. We have an extremely engaged group of experts who regularly participate and contribute to our work. Just this past year, we had more than 200 individuals from state and local governments, NGOs, private sector, and the business communities participate in our quarterly meetings and on our work group efforts. The ARWG works closely with the Commission's Scientific and Technical Working Group to incorporate the latest climate guidance, research, and science into our priorities and work. As you heard from Dr. Goodwin, a one-size-fits-all approach is not effective when planning for a more resilient Maryland, as climate change impacts is not experienced uniformly across the state and within our communities. It is this localized approach to addressing current and future risks, including adaptation efforts undertaken by our local partners and local government partners, that frames the work of the ARWG. So if you go to slide 2, Mark. So just like a quick overview of some of the accomplishments of the work group over the past 10 or so years. So in addition to developing comprehensive strategies to help focus the work of the state and local implementers, the ARWG plays an important role as a center for conversation on climate adaptation and resilience. The work group helps to coordinate evolving science, identify gaps, create opportunities for collaboration among the practitioners. Examples of this work include working with the Department of Natural Resources to develop methodologies to ensure that all potential land acquisitions are reviewed for climate change impacts, including sea level rise, storm surge, and shoreline erosion. The ARWG was instrumental in launching the nation's first state-sponsored Climate Leadership Academy to help local governments, state agencies, nonprofits, and the private sector prepare to address the impacts of global warming. The Academy, established in 2008, has provided more than 700 state and local government infrastructure and business leaders critical training on climate preparedness and risk management. The ARWG work with the Critical Areas Commission in their efforts to ensure that development in the critical area consider coastal hazards, extreme weather events, and sea level rise, and to incorporate climate resiliency practices where possible. In 2020, the ARWG convened a partnership of Maryland Sea Grant, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, the Maryland Department of Planning, DNR, and the Maryland Department of Environment to develop and publish guidelines to assist local jurisdictions in the development of nuisance flood plans, resulting in the completion of 23 local plans. The ARWG provided guidance to the Maryland Department of Transportation and the development of their new urban tree program, established this past year to promote sustainable practices that would improve local water quality, local air quality, enhance bicycle and pedestrian connections to transit, alleviate urban heat island effects, and prioritize work and communities affected by environmental justice issues. And then in 2015, the ARWG worked with the Nature Conservancy to undertake and complete a statewide vulnerability assessment of natural and built infrastructure. The state then used this assessment as a targeting framework for Governor Hogan's innovative Resiliency Through Restoration program, the first of its kind that uses natural and nature-based solutions to proactively protect communities, infrastructure, and public resources from climate-related impacts. Okay, next slide. So just one last example of this kind of center for conversation role that the ARWG plays has been the ongoing collaboration between the ARWG and the Maryland Coastmark Council, as how these two groups work together is a question I get asked often. As you may be aware, Maryland's Coastmark Council was established in 2014 to ensure coastal flooding and sea level rise and considered in the planning, budget, and design of capital projects. These two groups work together to share expertise and guidance regarding evolving science, practices, and in the development of decision support tools. A recent example, pictured here in the slide, is the development of the Coastmark Climate Ready Action Boundary, or CS-CRAB, to better predict the risk associated with long-term sea level rise and short-term storm effects. It gives me great pride to know that in 2021, that my colleague at the Maryland Department of Environment, Dave Gannett, received national recognition on behalf of the work group by FEMA for best practices in management technology innovation for this work. So then next slide, looking forward towards this year, towards 2022. Some of the priorities that we'll focus on this year, ARWG will look to build on the success of the Maryland Climate Adaptation Resiliency Framework, in which ARWG and the University of Virginia undertook a 2-year, highly collaborative, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder effort to bring forward a comprehensive set of strategies and recommendations to advance climate adaptation and resilience. The ARWG will use this framework as we work with the Maryland Climate Change Commission to prioritize our work over the coming years. This year, we will work to advance recommendations in Maryland's saltwater intrusion plan, led by our colleagues at the Maryland Department of Planning, and will focus specifically on opportunities to identify strategies and solutions to support wetland migration and inform the future development of a statewide wetland adaptation plan. The work group continues to recognize the need to prepare Maryland and its communities to take advantage of upcoming federal funding and public-private partnership opportunities that promote the use of natural infrastructure to build resilience to climate impacts. And this year, we will work to develop tools and strategies that could increase the state and local capacity to maximize and compete for future funding opportunities. And then, in addition to some of the ongoing work that the ARWG does, this year we will focus on human health implications of climate change, and we'll work with the Department of Health to provide tools, resources, and technical assistance for state and local agencies, communities, and organizations to help them think about health and how to use health data as they develop climate adaptation plans. So in a nutshell, that's the ARWG work group. And now I'd like to introduce co-chairs of the mitigation work group, Mike Powell with the law firm of Gordon Feinblatt, and Kim Coble again, well, not again, but yet Kim Coble again for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters.
Thank you, Matt. Mark, you can bring up the first slide that just shows the mitigation working group. The mitigation working group is the group that was put together to actually draft a plan for greenhouse gas reduction. It's a widespread group. We had over 30 formal members, but when you include the groups that worked on various subtasks, the sub-working groups, we had them. We're talking about literally hundreds of people who worked on this issue. A balanced group. We had 8 people from environmental organizations, 6 from labor and business, and 3 more from energy companies. So a very balanced group. So what were we trying to do? This is the modeling results, a very extensive, complicated modeling results showing what would be the impact of various policies. The gray line you see there, the 2020 reference, is basically a no further action line. It's okay, we've adopted a lot of things. There are some things that the feds are doing. If we don't propose anything else new, what happens to greenhouse gas emissions? If you look at the little 3 black circles there, one labeled 25% below 2006 emissions, 40% below, and then there's a number 80%. In existing law, those are the targets that the mitigation working group was proposed to meet. We had to develop a plan and a set of policies that, while having a net economic benefit and a net positive benefit on jobs, would meet those emission targets. In 2019, we developed a plan to try to achieve those. That purple line is the modeling of the plan we developed in 2019. As you can see, we managed better than the 2020 goal. We managed significantly better than the 2030 goal. But when you model it out, we would not meet the 80% number for 2050. Frankly, it gets really hard out that far. Some of us believe that we're going to need technology improvements. We're going to need some new advances, something beyond what we can foresee now, but we at least are doing a whole lot better than the 2020 reference. 2 things came up since 2019 that we have done. One, as Peter very ably summarized, the UN group proposed new targets for what is necessary. What do we need to do in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? The red line you see there are basically what Maryland would need to do to be in compliance with the IPCC recommendations. We would need to achieve not a 40% reduction by 2030, but a 50% reduction by 2030. And by 2045, we'd have to have a net zero carbon emissions. Not the 80% by 2050, but net zero by 2045. So these are significantly tougher targets to meet. So we went back to the drawing board and we started trying to draft new policies. And we've come up with the 2030 GGR plan. As was mentioned, there's 52 recommendations in that. We're not going to try to walk through all of them. The plan is available on the Department of the Environment site. But to give you an idea what the modeling shows, that green line says what would our policies as proposed adopted. Remember, these are policies intended to have a net economic benefit, a net benefit on positive jobs, and be respectful of impacts on minority and disadvantaged communities. You can see that we would meet the new 2030 goal of a 50% reduction. We still don't get to the net zero, so we're still going to have work we're going to need to do. But frankly, nothing we could draft today is going to meet net zero currently. There's something that we're going to have to work on. Next slide. So what's the overall theme? And Kim's going to walk you through some of the specific proposals. But the bottom line is that clean electricity is the heart of all the plan. The only way we can replace fossil fuel use is with clean electricity. We mentioned solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear would fall into this category too. They're the only sources of energy that we have that are going to come close to meeting the net zero standards. But that means we got to fuel everything with this clean energy. All vehicles, all buildings. And when we're talking about that kind of increase in load, particularly an increase in load which is intermittent, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, but the demands from the vehicles and demand from the buildings may occur even when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So we've got to talk about significant improvements in the grid. We got to talk about huge amounts of increases in energy storage. And we got to talk about how we get the flows of energy to go where we need them at a particular time. But this is the focus of the plan, of the 52 recommendations that you'll see. And now at this point, let me turn it back to my co-chair, Kim Coble, to talk about some of the specific proposals that we worked on this year. Kim?
Thank you, Mike. There we go. As I had mentioned in the introduction, a big focus of, frankly, the last 2 years of the mitigation work group has been to look at the building sector. And the GGRA required this, but the mitigation work group really dove into it. There's a subcommittee formed, and there's an entire plan put together to transition our buildings from where they are now to where they need to be to meet the climate reduction goals that Mike mentioned. So I'm not going to walk you through every aspect of that plan, but I do encourage you to give it a look. It's a great read. A couple things I want to point out, though, is that, as Mike pointed out, electrifying and taking our buildings off fossil fuel is one of the recommendations. For any new construction, we want to take them off fossil fuels, put them into electrification and clean energy sources. And that's a recommendation that's in there. We call on creating building codes in order for that to occur. The other is, what do we do with existing buildings? And there is a recognition that these buildings do need to be upgraded. They do need to be changed, especially the heating and cooling systems, and we want those to be as clean as possible. So we have to look to incentivize that. How can we create a system where existing buildings can reduce their emissions and be respectful and adhere to the goals, that the economic goals of the plan as well. The net zero, so there's two goals that are in the building plan. One is for large commercial buildings to be at net zero emissions by 2040. And this is an aggressive goal, but one we believe really helps to drive that. If you think back on the graph that Mike presented, that's one of the key recommendations to get there. I want to point out, though, that the other thing that we're recommending is that the state itself provide some leadership in this area, and that we start really getting state-owned buildings to be at net zero emissions by 2035. So we're looking for some leadership from the state. There's also recognition in the plan that none of this can work without the infrastructure, the utility grid infrastructure, and we need a utility transition plan to be created so that we can support the systems that we're building. So again, the building transition plan was a big part of our recommendations this year, and I encourage you to look at that. Next slide. In addition, we had other recommendations as well. And as I said, there's over 50 of them. So please look at the report. A couple that I want to highlight is, as Mike mentioned, we have to move our transportation systems to be zero emission transportation. And we're calling for diesel school buses and transit buses, locally operated transit buses, to become zero emission vehicles, and to do that as soon as possible. We're also calling on that the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, is an initiative that is up and down the East Coast, and we're part of that initiative, and it's saying that we need to transition to 100% clean electricity generation in Maryland by 2040, an ambitious goal, critical goal. Again, looking for state leadership and developing a plan that the state, not only the buildings, but other operations, the transportation systems, the infrastructure systems, are at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. And as Matt so importantly laid out, the other part of this equation is, how do we adapt? How do we build resiliency? How do we make sure that we're mitigating and able to manage the impacts adequately? And we are calling for carbon sequestration programs to really be enhanced through different programs and incentives. So lots of recommendations. Those are some highlights from the MWG. And I will turn it back to my Jody and John, I believe.
All right,
Thank you
folks.
so much. Sorry. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Joe. Well, we've run a little longer than we'd hoped, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about what ECO does, but I think today's presentation is an example of what the ECO Working Group does for the Commission. But we'd like to move on and take advantage of some of the time remaining to address some of the questions posed by audience members. Jody?
That's right, John. Thank you. We have a question. Please talk about the Commission's views on incineration generally, and specifically having incineration as part of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Does the Commission support the Reclaim Renewable Energy Act? Mike, I'm wondering if you could take this question.
Sure. The Commission has not made a specific recommendation on that act. We don't normally endorse bills so much as it's endorsed policies. And we did not make a recommendation specifically on incineration. The category of biomass to energy is complicated, and we tried to work as much as possible by consensus. And one of the things we've done is establish a working group this year that is looking specifically on biomass to energy issues, more than just incineration, but biomass to energy generally, looking at the benefits and detriments of that. So it may be that we will have a recommendation next year, but we do not have any current recommendation on incineration.
Thank you, Mike. Another question that's been sent to us. Does the Commission have a plan to address the Maryland supply chain emission? Kim or Mike, I was wondering if you could take that question for us.
I can, Kim, unless you would like to. It's an interesting issue that we looked at. One of the things that we did during the course of the many meetings we had were, okay, with the pandemic going on, this sounds unconnected, but it is connected. With the pandemic going on, we have a lot fewer people driving and commuting into work. And so is there a lasting benefit to us in the greenhouse gas emissions there? And one of the things that was pointed out on the modeling is we had fewer people commuting, but we got a lot more trucks on the road delivering goods because everybody's getting Amazon delivered to their houses rather than going to the local shopping center. So the answer is that is a problem, but it's also something that is rapidly changing, and it's hard for us to predict what exactly greenhouse gas policies are going to have impact on the supply chain issues. But it is something we're trying to model, and it's just that the ground is shifting under us so fast.
And just as a quick follow-up, where we did address this is to call for the transition of trucks and vehicles and whatnot to be low and zero emission vehicles.
It's some very ambitious goals we set for electrification of vehicles. I mean, currently we're talking about less than 1% of small vehicles in Maryland being electric, and we're talking about something like 300,000 by 2030. That's going to be very hard to meet those numbers, but then the manufacturers are starting to turn them out as fast as they can. But it's all of this is a challenge, and we should never underestimate or how difficult this will be.
Thank you, Mike. We have another question here. Is it feasible to reduce emissions more than 50% by 2030? Who would like to volunteer to take that one?
Well, I'm going to do the first, and then I'll turn it over to Mike. And actually, Peter, you may have some thoughts on this too, but yes, it's feasible. It's not going to be easy. And the mitigation work group did a number of models looking at, okay, if we do this, if we do that, if we, and really tried to understand the impact of different actions. And we could get a little bit better than 50% using the models. But as Mike mentioned, there's going to be new technologies coming down the pike that are going to be key. And if we start to really look at net emissions so that we can bring in the adaptation aspects of the work and to plant more trees and make sure that we're using the blue carbon systems, et cetera, so that we end up net having reductions, then we can even be more ambitious about it.
Yeah, one of the things I would add to that is the strictures under which we were operating were that whatever we proposed had to have a net economic benefit. It had to have a net positive benefit on jobs, and it had to not have an inordinate impact upon minority and disadvantaged communities. There are things that we could do that would be more aggressive, but then it becomes hard to not fall foul of one of those requirements, right? If you were prepared to have net negative impact, you're prepared to cut down jobs, if you're prepared to have some impact upon disadvantaged communities, you can do more. It becomes harder to find things that reduce more than 50% and don't run afoul of those. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it becomes more and more difficult.
Dr.
Secretary
Goodwin, anything
Grumbles?
to add? Or go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I would just say that it is possible. Anything is possible when you broaden the team, engage more people, sometimes people with skeptical views or expertise on a particular technology or impact. But when it comes to our climate ambition, we need great ambition followed up with realistic, doable actions, modeling, and engage everyone so that the economics, the social, the equity components of it are right along with it. And that's how this commission as an independent body brings real value to the discussion. And its recommendations should be looked at carefully and listened to. And it's a great question. We've got to, and with more leadership at the federal level, that certainly opens up more doors. And I'm not referring to trap doors. I'm talking about pathways to get to even greater, because we know we have to go well beyond 50 by 30 and to get to even bigger goals and accomplishments, to get to net zero by 2045. Very important to keep moving forward.
Yeah, perhaps I could just add to that. I certainly agree with Secretary Grumbles that federal actions that would help alleviate some of the constraints which your recommendations are based on could really make a difference. But I think the other thing that's happening is, just to build off what Mike said, it's not just the federal government, but looking at some of the large foundations, some of the industry that are putting up very significant sums of money to accelerate research around big ideas that could be scaled up around climate change. So, of course, we hope that will be there. Hope's not a strategy. I think we're seeing a very large acceleration in the investment by multiple sources, not just the federal government, in the technologies and the research that will help us accelerate. And of course, that's one of the things that the Commission and the Secretary has asked STWG to track, is to try and be ahead and understand what some of these breakthroughs might be, so that it could be factored at an early stage into the planning of the state.
I believe we're running out of time together today, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But I do want to remind everyone that we still welcome your questions by email. Feel free to send those anytime today to the Communications Director of the Climate Change Program, Susan Casey. Her email is in the chat box. I'll read it out loud as well. Susan.Casey, C-A-S-E-Y, number 1, @maryland.gov. And we will coordinate a response back to you. From there, I'm going to give this back to John.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance and attention and your excellent questions. Again, if we didn't have a chance to answer them, please do email them to the department at Susan Casey's email address. So I'd like to turn it over again to Secretary Grumbles for any closing remarks he has.
I would just simply say, as Peter Goodwin emphasized, when you're focusing not just on the public sector or on the federal government or on state government or on local government, where so much of the actions will happen, but you look at all of public and private sector engagement, that's the key for us. The success of the commission is to focus on science and civility and urgency and inclusion, citizens and people who have solutions. And with that, we can be optimistic that we're going to make dramatic progress and we're going to have game changers. We can't give up. We have to keep pushing and building bridges and partnerships. And so I want to thank everyone on the commission and all the people behind the commission who are volunteers. We've been successful, but we need to keep improving and engaging more. So everyone, please, citizens, please read the report, which you have access to, and join a meeting sometime. We have our quarterly meetings. It's a good opportunity to listen in and add value. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, John and Jody, for making this all possible, and Mark Stewart and your team, everyone else. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.